Okay, I'm going to begin to demonstrate the two-color brioche rib pattern. As you can see here, I've already cast on using the Italian cast on method about 15 stitches, and I'm starting and ending with my main color stitch, which is the blue, and the brown is the contrast color. So I'm going to begin with my setup row in main color, which is the blue, and in this stitch pattern, the first stitch is just going to be a knit on each edge stitch. That's just unique to this pattern to create the edge. You'll also notice that I'm using a circular needle. You could do this on a double point needle, provided you had enough room for your stitches, because we are going to need to slide the stitches back and forth to be able to knit each row in each color. And that is one of the things for two-color brioche. You do need to knit each row in each color. So I'm going to start now with the main color. I'm going to knit this first stitch. Again, that's unique to my pattern here. I'm just a plain knit stitch to create that edge. And now I'm ready to start my setup row in main color. The first thing I'm going to do is bring the yarn forward, and then I'm going to slip my next stitch, which is the contrast color stitch, purlwise. And as I do that, I'm going to take the working yarn over the top of the right hand needle and prepare to just knit the next stitch, which is a main color stitch. Get that one caught. And as I've done that, you can see now that these are my two knit main color stitches, and then there's a yarn over that's now paired with the slipped contrast color stitch. That's the brioche wrap, and we're going to be using those pairs together throughout this stitch pattern. Now I'm ready to slip my next one, my next contrast color stitch. So I bring the yarn forward, I'm going to slip that contrast color stitch and knit the next main color stitch. And in doing that knit stitch, I'm taking the yarn over the top of the needle, creating that yarn over the top of the slipped stitch. Again, yarn forward, slip the contrast color stitch, and begin to knit the next main color stitch. Now I'll switch to continental style just so you can see what that looks like. I'm a continental knitter by preference. It's easier for me. So you can see I bring the yarn to the front. I'm going to slip the next contrast color stitch purlwise, taking the yarn over the top of the needle, right hand needle, and knitting the next main color stitch. Yarn forward, slip, yarn goes over the top of the right hand needle, and I knit the next main color stitch. If it helps you to remember, we're always going to be slipping the stitch that is in the opposite color of the working yarn. And I'm going to be knitting the main color stitches. That's the yarn that I have in my hand. I'm going to knit this last edge stitch, and now I'm just going to slip this knot off my needle. That's the knot from the beginning of my two-color Italian cast on. It's just going to hang there. It's not going to bother anybody. Eventually I'll get around to untying that knot, and I'll have ends that I can weave in eventually. Now, I may be tempted to turn here, but I've got to slide my stitches to the other end of the needle instead, so that I can begin to work across the row with my contrast color. So I'm going to slide the stitches. Now when I slide, I try to hold them in the right orientation. They will try to twist around on you, and if they do, you just got to work to make sure that they're untwisted when you get to working them, so that they're in the right orientation. Okay, now I'm going to pick up the other end of my needle here. In my pattern, these edge stitches are going to be slipped when I'm working the contrast color. It's just unique to this pattern for the edge. And now I'm ready to begin what we call the brioche purl. So I bring the yarn to the front, and I'm going to purl together the contrast color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. And I'm doing this continental just to show you that first, and then I'll switch. So you see I've purled those two stitches together. Now I'm going to, with the yarn in front, I'm going to slip the next main color stitch purlwise, and as I'm doing that, I take the yarn over the front, over the top of the needle, back to the front, ready to purl my contrast color and its corresponding wrap together. Now again, I'm going to slip the next main color stitch, and as I'm doing that, I take the yarn over the top of the needle, bring it back to the front, ready to purl the next pair. Let me show you what that looks like as with the English method, throwing the yarn. Again, keeping the yarn in the front, I'm going to take with the yarn in the front, slip this main color stitch purlwise, taking the yarn over the needle, back around to the front, ready to purl the next contrast color pair and its corresponding yarn over wrap. And again, as I slip the next main color stitch, yarn goes over the needle, back around to the front between the needles, ready to purl the next pair together. You can see this is a little awkward for me because I normally do this in continental. Slipping the stitch, taking the yarn over the top of the needle, back around to the front, ready to purl the next pair together. Almost finished across the row. One more slip, taking the yarn over the top of the needle, back around, ready to purl the last pair. And I'm going to end this row, whoops, I slipped off there without actually having the purl done. I'm going to end this row, let me catch those back up there. There we go. By slipping that last main color stitch. And again, that's the edge stitch that's unique to my pattern. Now, I'm going to turn because I've got both the main color and the contrast color on the same side, so I can turn my work to begin to work row 1 of the 2-color brioche pattern. Those last 2 rows were just setup rows. Turn my work, and as you can see, this doesn't really look like much of a stitch pattern, but bear with it. It will begin to emerge over a few more rows. You'll begin to see the pattern emerge. Right now it does look like a royal mess. So I'm ready now to start row 1 of the main color with the main color yarn. Again, I'm going to knit this first stitch. It's my edge stitch. In this pattern, it's just knit. Then I'm going to slip my next stitch with yarn in front. And now I'm ready to do my brioche purl or burp. These 2 stitches together, the main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Keeping the yarn in front, I'm going to slip that contrast color stitch, take the yarn over the needle, back around to the front, and purl the main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over together. One more time in continental. I'm going to, with the yarn in front, slip the contrast color stitch purlwise, take the yarn, the working yarn over the needle, back around to the front, and burp the main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over together. Okay, I'll try to show you what this looks like in the throwing method. And again, it's a little awkward for me, but I'll give it a shot. I'm ready to slip my contrast color stitch. So I'm going to have my yarn in front, slipping the stitch purlwise, take the working yarn over the right hand needle, back around to the front, ready to purl the main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over wrap together. Slip the contrast color stitch, yarn goes over the needle, back around to the front, ready to burp the main color stitch and its yarn over together. And we just continue to work in that fashion across, whoops, don't burp the single one. We're going to slip that contrast color stitch, take the yarn over the needle, and burp the main color stitch. Again, slip the contrast color stitch, yarn over the needle, back to the front. And actually, in this case, I've got my last edge stitch now. I'm just going to knit it. So I'm going to take my yarn just over the needle. I don't need to come back to the front because I'm just going to knit that edge stitch. Unique to this pattern, the edge stitches are going to be kept in garter stitch throughout. So now you can see I finished one of row 1 with the main color. Now again, my contrast color is still back over here on the right hand side, so I need to slide my stitches to the end of the needle. I'm not going to turn yet. Slide everything back to the other end of the needle. And again, as you do that, be careful just to keep all the stitches in the correct orientation. It will make it a little easier than having to try to sort it out. Okay, now I'm ready to do row 1 contrast color. I'm going to slip that first stitch that's just unique to my pattern here, and I'm going to, now what I'm going to do is called a bark, which is the brioche knit stitch. I'm going to knit this contrast color stitch and its corresponding yarn over together. Bring the yarn to the front, slip the main color stitch, take the yarn over the needle to the back, and bark or brioche knit the next pair together. Take the yarn to the front, slip the contrast color stitch, yarn over the top of the needle so that I can bark the next pair together. One more time in continental, yarn to the front, slip the contrast color stitch, or I'm sorry, the main color stitch purlwise, and bark together the contrast color and its corresponding yarn over. I'll switch now so you can see what it looks like as a thrower. Bring the yarn to the front, slip the next stitch purlwise, and bark together the contrast color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Yarn forward, slip the stitch, bark the next contrast color stitch and its yarn over. Yarn forward, slip the main color stitch, and bark. And because this last stitch is my edge stitch, I'm just slipping it so it stays in the main color. Okay, still you can maybe just now begin to see the two-color brioche rib pattern emerging. It may take a few more rows before you can see it in your own work. Okay, I'm going to turn because both my main color and my contrast color are now on the same side, so I know I can turn my work to begin row 2 with the main color. I'm going to just simply knit this first edge stitch, and then I'm going to begin my brioche pattern. If I can simply knit this first stitch. There we go. Okay, row 2 begins with a yarn forward and slip the contrast color stitch. Now, if you're just looking at your work and you're not sure what to do, remember that you're never going to knit the stitch on the needle with the opposite color yarn. You're always going to knit the stitch in the needle with the same color yarn. So this is a contrast color stitch. I know I'm not going to knit it with my main color yarn, so I'm going to slip it, taking the yarn over the needle, and now I'm going to bark together my main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Knit those together. Yarn to the front, slip that contrast color stitch over. As the yarn goes over the needle, I'm going to knit my next pair. Now, how do I know whether I knit or purl the pair? Well, let's just take a look at our stitches here quickly. You can begin to see that there's a bump right here. That's a purl bump. So I know that this is my purl rib row right here. So I'm going to slip that one. It's in the contrast color. Now as I get to the next stitch, do I knit or purl it? Well, if I look at that column, you can see that that's a column of knit stitches. It's not, maybe not as obvious yet. It will become more obvious as you get more and more rows completed. But that's a knit column, so I know I have to bark together those two stitches, the main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Yarn forward, slip the contrast color stitch, ready to bark the next pair. Let me switch over again and just show you what it looks like as a thrower. Yarn forward, slip the contrast color stitch, and bark together my main color stitch and its corresponding yarn over. Yarn forward, slip, back yarn to the back so that I can knit my next pair. Yarn forward, slip, and I'm going to knit that final edge stitch. One more row to complete the pattern, and that's the contrast color, row 2. And again, as we just discussed, if I look at my knitting, I'm going to slip this first main color edge stitch here. Again, that's unique to my pattern. Now, just looking at my knitting, I can begin to see that the contrast color on this side is forming the purls. You can see that that's a purl bump in there, and I can see that my main color is definitely a stockinette stitch column. So just going by the look of what's happening with my fabric, I can begin to now look at and see that I'm going to do a brioche purl. Those two together, yarn in front, slip the main color stitch, take the yarn over the needle, back to the front, and purl or burp that pair together. Yarn forward, slip over the needle, and purl that pair. Yarn stays forward, slip, yarn over the needle, and purl or burp that pair. Okay, let me switch, show you what it looks like as a thrower. The yarn stays forward. I'm going to slip that next main color stitch, take the yarn over the needle, back around to the front, and now purl or burp the pair together. Slip, yarn forward, over the needle, around to the front again, and burp the next pair together. Slip, yarn over the needle, back around to the front, and burp the next pair together. And slip the last edge stitch there. Just give it a little snug, tighten it up there. These edges will tighten up as you move along. So you can begin to see the pattern emerging. Continue on with those 2 rows of each color. So you're going to do row 1 main color, row 2 main color, and row 1 contrast color followed by row 2 contrast color. And that will create your brioche rib pattern.